Hey, welcome all to your second and last video for this week. We're going to talk about solving and simplifying with operations on functions in a second, but I just want to give you a reminder that you do have a quiz tomorrow. It will be some math problems. It's also going to be problems that are going to help me understand how well you're using Google Classroom and how well you understand some of the changes that I've made for a lot of you because you were in my class last year. It's going to feel very similar. You're not going to need to study the syllabus, but I wanted to give you the heads up that those questions are going to be appearing. So if you haven't already, make sure that you're checking your answers for for Tuesdays and today's work. Once you're done with it, in the back of the book, you're nominating any problems that you got stuck on. If you nominated a problem, see if I've posted an answer, and that you're posting the presentation problems for Tuesday and then for today once you're done with that. So we're going to be looking at Chapter 1, Section 3. We're going to be talking about operations of functions. Now, operations, if you remember, are just add, subtract, multiply, divide, for the most part, those types of things. And when they come to functions, they work basically the way you think that they should. Meaning that, like for example here, it says find f times g. That means you're going to multiply the function f times the function g. Literally, you're going to say, okay, well, then that's the square root of 45 minus t squared times t to the 3 over 2. We're going to simplify that, but again, like I said, they work the way you feel like they should. Just put whatever operation you need in there and then simplify. I will warn you that sometimes the domains and ranges can get a little weird, and we're going to look at that in problem number 2. So let's start by simplifying number 1. So f times g is two terms that maybe don't look like they're similar, but what you might remember from previous years is t to the 3 halves can be rewritten as t times root t, because this is 1 and a half, so 1 and then a half. And then we have two radical terms, 45 minus t squared times t root t. So what I'll usually do here is just like we normally would, bring the rational term out front that's not in the square root, and then combine the radical terms, multiply them together. So 45 minus t squared times root t. And we end up with our final answer, t times 45t minus t cubed. And we're not going to talk about domain and range for this one, but we will for the next. So one operation that's specific to functions is called composition. And that's written like what we see here, with a little circle in between, or as f of g. And it's basically just a fancy way of saying plug one function into the other. So I've kept number 1 there because we're still going to use the same f and g. And one thing that some of you might find helpful is to say, okay, well, f of g, which is how you'd read this, is the same as f of g of t like this. And you can plug it in a little bit slowly. You can say, okay, well, here's f, because that's the first function. And then instead of t, you're going to plug in g. So g squared. And then you can use the function here to plug that in. So in this case, root 45 minus t to the 3 halves squared, and simplify. So root 45 minus stays the same, and then the exponents on t will simplify out to t cubed. And that's what f of g equals. So this part probably feels pretty familiar. Now, as I warned, the domain gets a little bit weird. So I'm going to erase some of this work and give myself some space. You all obviously don't erase your work. Keep that written, and then we'll talk about the domain. All right, so there's 2 things that you have to consider when we come across the domain of this. First is the way you normally would, is you're looking at something with a root, which means that it's going to have some restrictions on the domain. And so you can just start out by looking at the function that we came up with. root 45 minus t cubed. Now, since it's a root, we know that the material inside has to be, so 45 minus t cubed, has to be greater than or equal to 0, because we can't have a negative number in there. When you solve that by adding t cubed to both sides and taking the cube root, you get that t has to be less than or equal to the cube root of 45, which should be some decimal if you want to grab a calculator. Now, this is the domain of this function if it was its own separate entity, but because it's a composed function, we also have to worry about what values are possible for g, because g is what's getting plugged into. So the idea is that even if you plugged in a number that satisfies this, if it wouldn't work in the first equation, you can't have then plugged that number in. So you're looking for the overlap between this function and the domain of g. So that means the next thing you have to do is find the domain of g and compare. So g is also a root, and so therefore it also cannot be, cannot have a negative number in there. So we end up with t by itself for g has to be greater than or equal to 0. And so then the domain of f of g is where these overlap. So if you think about it on a number line, the first domain would be t has to be less than the cube root of 45. If you type it into the calculator, that ends up being about here, in between 3 and 4, so it's got to be less than that. But for g says it has to be greater than 0. And so then the domain of f of g is just where those two overlap here. So you can write that in interval notation to say that the domain goes from 0, closed because we're including 0, to the cubed root of 45, which we're also including. And that's the domain of f of g. The last thing I want to talk about with composition is that you can compose functions with themselves. So if you want to say g of g, you can say that, which would be, in this case, g to the 3 over 2, which would be t to the 3 over 2 to the 3 over 2. Multiply those exponents together to simplify. You get t to the 9 over 4 as g of g. So hopefully this was pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, or you can send them to me or ask me about them in our one-on-one meeting if you haven't already. Make sure that if you're stuck on any homework problems from the last lesson, or if you end up being stuck on any of these, you've nominated them in the form, and that you've attached the Tuesday and Thursday presentations to these by Friday. Look through your email, see if you've gotten any feedback from me about any problems that you might have nominated that just didn't have a ton of questions from the whole class, as well as any other things that you might have left a comment on and I've responded to them on Google Classroom. I'm excited to see how well you've worked through this first week of distance learning of the school year, and as always, please be in contact if you have any questions or anything that you think that I could help with, even if it's in another class. Talk to you later.